The throne room of the Draconis Empire stretched wider than most planetary capitals. Crystalline pillars rose toward a ceiling lost in shadow, and between them floated holographic star maps showing thousands of conquered worlds. At the center of this vast chamber, Queen Vex'ahlia stood alone, her scale form shimmering like molten gold in the dim light. She was dying, not from disease or age, but from inevitability. Her species, the mighty Draconis who had ruled the galaxy for 3,000 years, were fading. The wars had taken too many. Genetic decline had withered their bloodlines. In the past century, only 12 hatchlings had survived, and none carried the royal markers. Without an heir, the empire would tear itself apart. Vex'ahlia's clawed hand trembled as she placed it upon the altar of succession, an ancient stone that predated spaceflight. The ritual carved into its surface had not been performed in 300 years. Most believed it had never truly worked, just mythology wrapped in ceremony. But she had no other options. She spoke the words in the old tongue, her voice echoing through the empty throne room. The altar began to glow, pulsing with a deep amber light that spread outward like ripples on water. The call of succession was spreading across the galaxy, searching for someone, anyone, worthy to answer. Thousands of light years away, on a forgotten colony world called Terra Minor, Kale was scrubbing floors. The orphanage was old, built from prefabricated materials that had weathered decades of neglect. 17 years old and considered too young for military service but too old for adoption, Kale existed in a gray space where nobody wanted him. He'd spent his childhood staring at the stars through cracked windows, dreaming of ships and adventure, while his hands grew raw from work. Tonight felt different. He paused mid-scrub, his heart suddenly pounding. A warmth spread through his chest, foreign and overwhelming. It felt like someone was calling his name from very far away. Except it wasn't his name exactly. It was everything he'd ever wanted to be. Kale dropped the brush and stumbled to the window. The stars seemed brighter, closer. One in particular burned with an intensity that hurt to look at. He pressed his hand against the cold glass and whispered without knowing why, "I'm here." The response was immediate. A presence touched his mind, ancient and powerful, surprised and angry and desperate all at once. Then it was gone, leaving Kale gasping on the floor. 3 days later, a ship descended on Terra Minor. Not a human vessel, but something that made the ground shake and the sky darken. The Draconis scout ship landed in the orphanage courtyard, crushing the garden that the children tended. Kale was dragged before beings he'd only seen in historical broadcasts. The Draconis towered over him, their reptilian features both beautiful and terrifying. The lead scout, a scarred warrior named Thex, looked at Kale with undisguised contempt. Thex's voice was like grinding stone. This creature answered the call. Kale tried to speak, but found his voice failing. He was nobody, an orphan from a species the galaxy barely noticed. Humans were good at fixing machines and farming distant worlds, but they held no power, commanded no respect. Scan him again. Thex demanded of a subordinate. There must be an error, but the scanner confirmed it. Somehow, impossibly, this human boy had answered the sacred call of succession. The ritual that had been silent for centuries had found him across the void and marked him as worthy. Kale was given no time to say goodbye. They bound his wrists, not with chains but with ceremonial cords that indicated he was a prisoner of significance, and took him aboard the ship. As Terra Minor disappeared behind them, one of the younger Draconis guards spoke to him in accented human standard. "You should not have answered," she said quietly. "The queen is desperate, but the noble houses will never accept you. You are walking into a nest of predators who see you as prey." Kale looked at her. "Why tell me this?" "Because you will die," she said. "And perhaps you should know that before you meet her." The journey to the Draconis homeworld took 5 days in hyperspace. Kale spent that time in a cell, his mind racing. What had he done? What did it mean to answer a call he didn't understand? He wanted to escape Terra Minor his whole life, but not like this. Not to face certain death in an alien court. When the ship finally docked, they marched him through corridors that made him feel like an insect. Everything was built for beings 3 times his size. Finally, they reached the throne room. Queen Vexalia stood waiting, and Kale's breath caught. She was magnificent and terrible, her golden scales reflecting the light of 1,000 worlds. Her eyes, ancient and exhausted, fixed on him. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then the queen's voice filled the chamber, cold and sharp. "Explain yourself, human. Why did you answer my call?" Kale stood in the center of the throne room, surrounded by dozens of Draconis nobles who watched him like hungry predators. Their scales ranged from deep crimson to midnight blue, each one representing a different house of power. The weight of their stares pressed down on him like gravity itself. "I didn't know what I was answering," Kale said, his voice steadier than he felt. "I only knew that someone was calling, and I needed to respond." A massive Draconis with blood-red scales stepped forward. Duke Sereth of House Crimson, the Queen's chief rival. His voice dripped with contempt. "This is an insult to our entire civilization. A human? They barely live a century. They have no natural weapons, no strength, no honor. Your Majesty, execute this creature and perform the call again." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the assembly. Kale felt his stomach twist. He was going to die here, far from home, because he'd followed an impulse he couldn't explain. But Queen Vexalia raised one clawed hand, and silence fell instantly. She studied Kale with those ancient eyes, and he saw something there he hadn't expected: curiosity. "The call has not been answered in 300 years, she said slowly. "When it finally finds someone, you would have me kill him without understanding why. Perhaps our ancestors were wiser than we assume." "Your Majesty," Sereth began. "He will face the trials of succession," Vexalia interrupted. "If he fails, nature will solve our problem. If he succeeds, even you must acknowledge the will of the ancients." The nobles erupted in protest, but the Queen's decision was final. Kale was given one night to rest before the trials began. They placed him in a small chamber, small by Draconis standards, still larger than any room he'd ever occupied, and left him alone with his fear. The first trial came at dawn, the trial of wisdom. They brought Kale to a chamber where a holographic display showed a star system under siege. It was a tactical simulation, one that Draconis military commanders had been unable to solve for months. The enemy forces were too numerous, the defenders too scattered. "You have 1 hour," the overseer announced. "Find a solution or fail." Kale studied the display, his heart pounding. The Draconis approach was obvious. They were trying to gather their forces for a massive frontal assault. Noble, direct, and doomed to fail. But humans had learned to survive by thinking differently. They'd spent centuries as underdogs in a galaxy of stronger species. He began moving the pieces, not gathering them but spreading them thinner. He used the scattered defenders to harass supply lines, to strike and retreat, to create chaos rather than seeking a decisive battle. It wasn't honorable. It was survival. When the hour ended, the simulation showed the enemy fleet in disarray. Their supply lines severed, their commanders confused. The defenders had won through attrition and frustration. The overseer stared at the results. "This is coward's tactics." "It's effective tactics," Kale replied quietly. The nobles looked disgusted, but they couldn't deny he'd solved what they could not. The Queen's expression remained unreadable. The second trial came that afternoon, the trial of strength. They threw Kale into an arena with a Draconis warrior half his age and 3 times his size. The crowd above roared as the warrior charged, moving with terrifying speed. Kale dove aside, barely avoiding claws that would have torn him apart. He couldn't win through strength. He didn't have it. But the arena was filled with obstacles, pillars, platforms, loose sand. Humans had spent millennia fighting things bigger and stronger than themselves. They'd learned to use everything. Kale grabbed a handful of sand and threw it in the warrior's eyes as he passed. He used the pillars for cover, staying mobile, never letting his opponent land a solid hit. He climbed to higher ground, forcing the larger creature to follow clumsily. When the warrior finally cornered him, Kale kicked the support beam he'd been loosening, bringing a platform down on his opponent's head. The warrior fell unconscious but alive. The arena fell silent. Then someone in the crowd hissed, the Draconis equivalent of booing. Dishonorable, they called. Trickery. But Kale was still standing. Queen Vexalia rose from her seat. He has passed 2 trials. Tomorrow comes the 3rd and final test, the bonding. If he survives, he becomes my heir. If he dies, then the ancestors have judged. That night, Duke Sereth visited the dragon stables in secret. He found Thundermaw, the oldest and most temperamental of the royal mounts, and made sure the beast would be starved and tormented before morning. Kale would enter the bonding chamber, expecting a test. Instead, he would face a creature driven mad with pain and rage. It would be called a tragic accident. As Kale lay in his chamber, unable to sleep, he didn't know that tomorrow wasn't designed to test him. It was designed to kill him. The bonding chamber was carved from a single piece of black stone, ancient and cold. Kale walked through the entrance alone, as tradition demanded. Behind him, the massive doors sealed shut with a sound like thunder. Above, in viewing galleries, the Draconis nobles gathered to watch what they believed would be his death. Queen Vexalia stood among them, her expression unreadable. She had given this human boy a chance, but even she doubted he could bond with a dragon. The creatures were proud, ancient, and chose their riders based on strength of spirit. What would a dragon see in a human? Kale's eyes adjusted to the dim light. The chamber was enormous, with chains hanging from the ceiling and scorch marks covering the walls. Then he saw movement in the shadows. Thundermaw emerged like a nightmare-given form. The dragon was massive, easily 50 feet long, with scales like dark iron and eyes that burned with rage. But something was wrong. Kale could see it immediately. The creature's movements were jerky, pained. Fresh wounds marked its flanks. Its breathing came in ragged gasps. This wasn't a test. This was an execution. Thundermaw roared and lunged. Kale threw himself sideways as flames scorched the air where he'd been standing. The heat was overwhelming. He scrambled behind a pillar as the dragon's claws tore chunks from the stone. In the gallery above, Duke Sereth smiled. "A pity," he said loudly. The human showed such promise. But Kale wasn't thinking about dying. He was thinking about the scars on the dragon's body, the wildness in its eyes. He'd seen that look before, in the eyes of children at the orphanage who'd been beaten and abandoned. It was the look of something pushed beyond endurance. Thundermaw circled, preparing another strike. Kale did something that made the watching nobles gasp in confusion. He stopped running. He sat down on the cold stone floor, his back against a pillar, and looked directly at the dragon. "I know," Kale said quietly. "I know it hurts." Thundermaw paused, head tilting slightly. The dragon's intelligence was ancient and sharp. It understood human speech, even if it couldn't speak it. "They hurt you to make you kill me," Kale continued. His voice was steady now, calm despite the fear coursing through him. "I've been hurt too. Different ways, maybe, but I understand what it's like when everyone sees you as something to use or throw away." The dragon took a step closer, flames flickering at the edges of its jaws. But it didn't attack. "I grew up in a place where nobody wanted me," Kale said. "Too young, too old, too human, too nothing. I scrubbed floors and fixed things and dreamed about being somewhere else, about mattering to someone." Thundermaw lowered its massive head, bringing one burning eye level with Kale. The boy could feel the heat radiating from the creature's scales, could smell sulfur and ash. One movement and he would die. "You matter to me," Kale whispered. "Not as a mount or a weapon or a test. As someone who suffered and survived. I see you." For a long moment, nothing happened. The gallery was silent. Even Duke Sereth had stopped smiling. Then Thundermaw did something unprecedented. The dragon lay down, bringing its head to rest on the ground near Kale. A low rumble came from deep in its chest, not a growl, but something softer. The dragon was crying. Kale reached out slowly and placed his hand on the dragon's scarred snout. The scales were hot enough to hurt, but he didn't pull away. "I won't hurt you," he promised. "I won't use you. If you let me, I'll be your friend. That's all I'm asking." The bond formed in that instant, not through dominance or conquest, but through recognition. Two beings who'd been cast aside, who'd been hurt and discarded, seeing each other truly. A silver light began to glow where Kale's hand touched Thundermaw's scales, spreading across both of them. In the gallery, the nobles stood in shocked silence. This wasn't how bonding worked. Draconis bonds were built on strength and respect earned through challenge. But this was something else entirely. Queen Vexalia felt something stir in her ancient heart. Hope, perhaps, or recognition that the galaxy was changing, whether her people were ready or not. Duke Seratha's face twisted with fury. He turned to leave, but found royal guards blocking his path. The Queen's voice rang out, cold and sharp. "Seize Duke Serath. I know what he did to Thundermaw. Torture a royal dragon is a capital offense." Sarah tried to protest, but the guards dragged him away. His execution would come before sunset. Below, Kale stood with his hand still resting on Thundermaw's head. The dragon's eyes had lost their madness, replaced with something that looked almost like peace. "We're going to be okay," Kale told his new companion. "Both of us." The dragon rumbled agreement, and for the first time in weeks, Thundermaw's pain began to ease. 3 months had passed since Kale bonded with Thundermaw. He'd spent every day learning the ways of the Draconis, their history, their politics, their military traditions. Queen Vexalia herself had become his teacher, though she remained distant, watching him with those ancient eyes, as if trying to solve a puzzle she didn't fully understand. Then the war came. The Exorall Collective had been waiting for weakness, and the Draconis succession crisis had given them the opening they needed. The insectoid hive mind empire crossed the border with a fleet of 10,000 ships, their coordination perfect, their tactics brutal. They'd already taken 3 systems, slaughtering millions. The War Council gathered in the strategy chamber. Admirals and nobles stood around a holographic display showing the Exorall advance. They were old warriors, scarred and proud, and they looked at Kale with barely concealed contempt. The human boy who'd somehow bonded with a dragon, who the Queen inexplicably insisted on including in military planning. Admiral Krax, a grizzled commander with silver scales, presented the battle plan. "We mass our fleet at the Cronus Belt, meet them head-on with overwhelming force, challenge their hive queens to single combat, honorable battle, decisive victory." The other admirals rumbled their agreement. It was a Draconis way, direct confrontation, strength against strength, glory in combat. Kale studied the display and felt his stomach sink. He'd been reading reports on the Exorall for weeks. Their hive-mind coordination meant they fought as one organism. Every ship, every soldier, perfectly synchronized. A direct assault would be a slaughter. "That plan will fail," Kale said quietly. The room went silent. Admiral Krax turned to him slowly, his eyes dangerous. "What did you say, human?" "The Exorall hive mind give them perfect coordination," Kale explained, trying to keep his voice steady. "They'll anticipate every traditional maneuver. A frontal assault plays directly into their strength. And what would you suggest?" Krax's voice dripped with sarcasm. "That we run and hide like cowards?" Kale took a breath. "We use asymmetric warfare. Hit-and-run attacks on their supply lines. Destroy their command nodes to disrupt hive coordination. Use the asteroid belt for ambushes. Make them fight on our terms, not theirs." The Admiral stared at him like he'd suggested surrendering. Admiral Krax slammed his clawed hand on the table. "Coward's tactics. Dishonorable. This is not how the Draconis wage war. But it's how humans survive." Kale shot back. "My species spent thousands of years fighting things bigger and stronger than us. We learned that honor doesn't matter if you're dead. Survival does." The argument would have continued, but Queen Vexalia spoke. "Kale will lead the defense of Cronus Belt. He will have 300 ships and full tactical authority." The admirals erupted in protest, but the Queen's word was final. As the council dispersed, Krax approached Kale. "You'll get good soldiers killed with your cowardice. Human, I hope your conscience can bear it." Kale met his eyes. "I hope yours can bear what happens if I don't try." The Battle of Cronus Belt began 2 days later. The Exorall fleet arrived expecting traditional Draconis tactics, a mass formation, a glorious charge. Instead, they found the belt seemingly empty. Then Kale's strategy unfolded. Small squadrons emerged from behind asteroids, striking supply ships and vanishing before the main fleet could respond. Kale had positioned explosives throughout the belt. turning space rocks into devastating weapons that scattered the Exoral formations. When the enemy tried to regroup, missiles fired from hidden platforms disrupted their hive communication nodes. The Exoral, designed for perfect coordination, found themselves fighting in chaos. Individual ships, cut off in the hive mind, made mistakes. Panicked, the perfect organism was becoming confused and afraid. On the bridge of his flagship, with Thundermore resting in the specialized hangar below, Kale watched the tactical display. His heart was pounding. Every decision he made meant lives, both saved and lost. A squadron he'd sent to destroy a command node had been caught and destroyed. 37 Draconis warriors dead because of his orders. But the strategy was working. The Exoral were taking 3 losses for every Draconis casualty. It was brutal, efficient, and completely unlike anything the enemy had expected. In the middle of the battle, something unexpected happened. Ships from other species in the Empire, beings the Draconis had always treated as lesser, began joining Kale's formation. They'd been watching, and they recognized his tactics. These were the methods their own people used, the survival strategies the proud Draconis had always dismissed. A Velix pilot, from a species of small 6-legged beings, sent a message. Finally, someone fight smart instead of proud. We're with you, Heir. The battle lasted 8 hours. When it ended, the Exoral fleet retreated, having lost nearly 40% of their forces. The Krona's belt was held, and the Empire was saved, for now. But as Kale walked to the medical bay afterward, seeing the wounded and dying, he felt the true weight of leadership. Victory had a cost measured in blood. Queen Vexalia found him there, standing beside a young soldier who wouldn't survive the night. She said nothing, just placed a clawed hand on his shoulder. Sometimes, that was all anyone could offer. The coronation ceremony was meant to be the Empire's moment of unity. The grand hall blazed with light from 1,000 floating crystals, and representatives from every species in the Empire had gathered. Kale stood at the center in ceremonial robes that felt strange on his human frame, waiting to be formally recognized as heir to the Draconis throne. Queen Vexalia began the ancient words, her voice carrying through the vast chamber. Kale felt Thundermaw's presence in his mind. The dragon was outside, too large for the hall, but connected to him always. Everything seemed perfect. Then Thundermaw's warning screamed through their bond. Danger, betrayal, death. The first explosion tore through the eastern gallery. Assassins in stolen guard armor poured into the hall, weapons firing. Civilians screamed and scattered. Kale saw 3 noble houses reveal themselves. Lords who had smiled at him during the War Council now showed their true faces. Lord Vextor of House Shadow stepped forward, a blade in each clawed hand. Behind him stood soldiers wearing Exoral technology. The conspiracy was revealed. These nobles had been working with the enemy all along, waiting for this moment. The Empire dies tonight, Vextor announced, and from its ashes we'll build something pure again. No humans, no lesser species, only true Draconis power. Kale drew the energy blade he'd been given, though he barely knew how to use it. Around him, loyal guards formed a protective circle, but they were outnumbered. He saw Admiral Krax, the same admiral who'd call him a coward, fighting back-to-back with a Velix pilot, defending the innocent. The battle was chaos. Energy bolts screamed through the air. The beautiful hall became a war zone. Kale fought desperately, his human reflexes barely keeping him alive against Draconis warriors bred for combat. Then he saw Queen Vexalia engage with 3 assassins at once. She was magnificent and deadly, but she was also old, and the wounds were mounting. One of the betrayers broke through her defense, blade aimed at her heart. Kale didn't think. He ran, throwing himself between the queen and the blade. The weapon punched through his shoulder, and pain exploded through his body. He fell, blood spreading across the ceremonial robes. Vexalia roared with fury and grief. Her claws tore through the assassin, then the others. She dropped to her knees beside Kale, and he saw something he'd never expected. Tears in those ancient eyes. "Foolish boy," she whispered. "Why?" "Because your family." Kale managed through the pain. "That's what family does." The queen pressed her clawed hand over his wound, trying to stop the bleeding. Around them, the battle was turning. Thundermaw had broken through the wall, his massive form crashing into the traitors. The loyal forces were rallying, pushing back the conspiracy. But Vex'ahlia was fading. Kale could see it. The wound she'd taken, the strain of the battle. Her ancient body was finally giving out. She'd lived for centuries, carried the weight of an empire, and now she was dying. "Listen to me," she said, her voice growing weak. "You were never meant to become like us. The Empire doesn't need another dragon on the throne. It needs what you are, someone who sees worth in all beings, not just the strong." "I don't know if I can do this," Kale admitted, his own vision blurring. "You already have," Vex'ahlia smiled. "You change us simply by being yourself. Promise me, build something better. Not an empire of conquest, but one of cooperation." Her hand went limp. The last queen of the old Draconis bloodline was gone. Kale felt the wound in his shoulder healing. Draconis medical technology was extraordinary, but the wound in his heart was deeper. He'd lost the closest thing to a parent he'd ever known. Lord Vextor, bloody but still standing, laughed bitterly from across the hall. "You see? Even she abandoned you in the end. Human, you'll never be one of us." Kale stood slowly, Thundermaw moving to stand beside him. He looked at the surviving nobles, the warriors, the civilians of a dozen species watching him. He saw hope in some eyes, doubt in others, hatred in a few. "You're right," Kale said clearly. "I'll never be Draconis. I'm human, and that's exactly what this empire needs." He raised his voice so everyone could hear. "The queen is dead. The old bloodline is finished. But the empire doesn't have to die with it. I claim the throne not as a Draconis heir, but as something new, a leader for all species, not just one." Admiral Krax, still bloody from battle, stepped forward. Slowly, deliberately, he knelt. "I called you a coward once. I was wrong. You have more courage than any warrior I've known." One by one, others knelt. Draconis, Velix humans, and species Kale didn't even recognize. The coronation continued, but it was different now. Not the crowning of a dragon prince, but the birth of something the galaxy had never seen. Years later, Kale stood on a balcony overlooking the new capital. The Vex'ahlia Academy rose in the distance, where children of every species learned together. The Empire had become a commonwealth, where strength was measured not in claws or scales, but in what each being could contribute. A young orphan approached, nervous but determined. She was Draconis, but small and weak by her species standards. "Lord Kale, they say you were an orphan too, that you came from nothing." Kale smiled and placed a hand on her shoulder. "I did. And you know what I learned? The Empire doesn't need you to be what it was. It needs you to help build what it can become." Thundermaw rumbled contentedly from his perch. Somewhere, Kale liked to think, a golden scale queen was smiling. The orphan who answered call had become the leader who changed everything.